Today is a great day for the Canadian Space Agency. 3, 2, 1, blast off. We have successfully launched Orbiter 1 into orbit around the planet Kerbal. Both Jebediah and Bill Kerbal have become national icons in the Canadian Space Agency and around the world. 3, 2, 1, and we have splashdown confirmed. The astronauts have arrived safely back on the planet.
After the successful launch of Orbiter 1, the Canadian Space Agency decided to focus its efforts into the satellite project, and thus the GeoSat project was kicked off. This project consisted of construction of 3 to 4 satellites to be positioned in geosynchronous orbit around the planet to allow for communications to occur no matter where a ship is while it orbits the planet. Though this project was hoped to be as successful as the Orbiter program that had just recently successfully completed its launch, not everything went by the book. The GeoSat 1 project was plagued with issues, stemming from launch clamp malfunctions to thrust issues, balance, and inevitably disaster. With many things, upgrades and maintenance were performed onto the rocket. Engines were checked, double-checked, upgrades were placed, new engines were tried, all in effort to get the GeoSat project off the ground. The engine worked, but stability then became an issue. The rocket just couldn't stay straight. Strutting was added to help increase stability of the rocket, hoping that this would finally solve the problems, but unfortunately, gimbal issues on the engines then started to act up, causing a great deal of a headache for the engineering team. Finally, gimbaling fixed, the rocket was launched, and all seemed well. The rocket progressed. It picked up a fair bit of heat as it entered into the upper atmosphere. The rocket, without any gimbal and unable to angle itself properly, could not brush off the heat by angle. Finally, the first stage burned off and was released. And with this, GeoSat 1 had made it to orbit. With the ignition of Stage 2, more malfunctions occurred. Engine staging malfunctioned, and engines were kicked off in a one-by-one fashion. This did not bode well for the pilot Jebediah, as it made the vehicle very difficult to control. But stability was regained thanks to Jebediah's skillful piloting and the use of RCS. The engines were cut, and a new maneuver was placed to put it into a more orbit around the planet. The fairings were released on GeoSat 1, and thus the satellite was fully exposed to space for the first time. With the new maneuver in place, the engines were fired another time to angle it into its orbit position. Unfortunately, this burn was too much due to the poor launch that came in the beginning. 2,000 meters of thrust was required to get us into a proper orbit. But unfortunately, the fuel didn't last as long as we hoped. Our calculations were wrong, and due to the irregular start of the engines, and the irregular burn of the fuel. Control was hard to maintain during the final moments of that burn. But again, Jebediah was able to regain control, and the satellite was put back on a more straighter path. It was then determined that it was time to deploy the satellite, leaving Jebediah behind and allowing the onboard guidance systems of the satellite to take over. Now, with the satellite fully deployed in space, it was time to position it. A burn was positioned, though it was not favorable due to the poor launch conditions that had occurred. As the burn started, the satellite began to enter into its attempt for orbit, but the gravity of the planet was too much, and it started to pull the satellite down. 50,000 meters above the surface, the heat intensified. And as the satellite continued to plummet at 35,000 meters, the heat built. But unfortunately, gravity was too much for this satellite, and in the end, it met its inevitable end. After the failure of the first launch, the second launch commenced, and GeoSat-1 was then relaunched after some minor tweaks and changes had been given to the ship to increase stability for this launch. With these changes, we were able to finally tilt the rocket into a more favorable angle for launch. Though still not angling enough, heat was built up while leaving the atmosphere, but not as much as last time. With this angle now achieved, the engines cut and repositioning was done for its first final burn of Stage 1. The fairings were released on GeoSat-1, revealing it once again to the harshness of space. This rocket positioned itself. The burn was then kicked off. Now, with such little fuel remaining in the stage, there wasn't much to do but to burn off that remaining fuel, allow it to finally cease, and then drop that stage. Though the release of that stage was not perfect as planned, no damage occurred on Stage 2. The rocket continued to proceed on its path to gather speed to put itself into the proper orbit. With this burn, we were able to achieve a better orbit, now almost achieving that perfect orbit with only 124 meters to go, but it was enough. The satellite was released and given its ability to be controlled remotely. After the solar panels were deployed, the lights were turned on, and it was released from Jebediah's control. It began its orbit around the planet to get into a better position. The satellite had a significant amount of fuel and only a small burn to perform. Once it was put into position and was ready, the engines were ignited and the burn commenced. Now, the Terrier engine on this rocket did not use as much fuel as the previous ones, allowing it to get to its point it needed. Now, being in position, the satellite is now attempting its second burn, deploying the main dish, angling itself for its burn. The satellite will then position itself for that final attempt at geosynchronous orbit. With another small burn, the engines were ignited and were burnt. Only a small amount of fuel was consumed during this burn, and the satellite was finally able to achieve that geosynchronous orbit around the planet. But there was something else to consider. Poor Jebediah was left inside of a capsule with no fuel and no way home. For Jebediah, the hero of the Canadian Space Agency, his fate was sealed. And with that, Jebediah was lost. The GeoSat-2 satellite did not have a very nice start, as we hear here from the director of the Canadian Space Agency. I received this in the mail. 1 second here. It's a letter from Prime Minister Trudeau. It says, "Dear Impromptu Director of Everything of the unofficial Canadian Space Agency program, we are very proud to see that you were able to launch your very first geosynchronous satellite into orbit in the name of Canada. But we regret to inform you that any funding that you receive will cease to exist if any further Kerbals are lost during these missions. Please remember that lives are very important and we do not want them simply sacrificed for a mere satellite. Sincerely, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau." With the message from the Prime Minister loud and clear, it was pretty clear what the director needed to do. A complete redesign of the rocket had to be performed. Changes were made. Different types of engines, different fuel cells were attached and reattached to the upper module. Once these changes were put into place, a launch was attempted. The module was loaded, the engines were prepped, the functions were enabled, and ignition was kicked off. But, unfortunately, not all went to plan. This rebuild number 1 did not fly as expected, did not propel itself in a manner in which the space agency wanted, and from the structural integrity of this vessel, it was clear that it wasn't going to make it far. And thus, of the new rebuilds, the first failure has occurred. It was back to the drawing board for the engineers. And then again, another change was made. To improve structural integrity, an entire stage of the rocket was removed and thrown away in favor of the more powerful bottom stage, which would suffice for this launch. This was attempted once again. The engines were lit, thrust was engaged, and the rocket lifted. Again, the tilt ensued, the lean occurred, and the top half started to wobble. All was looking fine for this launch as the rocket continued to climb, but then the unfortunate occurred. The top finally gave, and the rocket was unable to compensate. And with that, it gave to the weight of the now leaning upper side, and the struts just couldn't bear it. Again, more changes were made. Struts were added to the rocket to try and stabilize it that much more, in hopes that we can maintain a straighter upper portion of the rocket while strutting it to the rest of the body. This was attempted. A launch kicked off, and the rocket took off. As you can see, it was more stable this time around. The tilt, the wobble, it was much less than the previous launch, and with this, the rocket looked like it was gonna make it. Mission Control watched in awe until finally, the top swayed too far, and the rocket went into an irreversible vertical roll. RCS unable to compensate for this, the rocket continued to roll. And with this, the abort was hit, and the rocket then was given up for loss. Another rebuild was done. The rocket was then scrapped and in favor of a more powerful lower stage, allowing for the rocket to be smaller and maintain the same amount of thrust to get us to that point. With this build, a lot of hopes were put into it by the space agency. The build was finished, mounted onto the pad, and launched. But unfortunately, more structural integrity issues occurred. The rockets had too much give to them, not properly mounted to the rest of the body. The entire rocket gave way. Though a beautiful display it was, this meant a very uncertain descent for Mr. Bill Kerbal. Now, with the strutting of the rocket in place, many struts put in place, the space agency thought they overdid themselves this time. But again, the rocket was launched, though looking good, with much less of a give to those engines. It continued to climb. With no rock and only a slight rotation in the engine, the middle section started to wobble. And as that middle section started to wobble, it started putting undue stress onto the outer engines, until finally, they couldn't take any more. As they broke free, the main fuselage took an uneasy turn. More changes were made, and yet another launch was attempted. This time, there was a delay. A small explosion occurred just before launch. Unsure and unable to hit the abort, the rocket was launched, noticeably leaving 3 of its boosters behind. This uneven thrust unfortunately meant uncertain peril. With the space agency having such failures on its Geosat and orbiter program, it was not looking good for its future. Another redesign was made with much bigger engine base, using a 5mm sized rocket. It was then launched. These are now using Griffin engines, more powerful engines on this bigger fuselage size. There was a bit of give and tilt into the rocket, but it was looking much better this time around. The engineering team learned from its previous experiences and had strutted the upper portion of the rocket to the lower set. That caused the entire upper section to wobble as more of a whole. But as the rocket ascended and the air pressure picked up upon its descent, the wobble ceased and came into a more stable rise. Now, with the rocket up and into space at 119 kilometers up, a final burn was engaged for the first stage to get it into position and into that orbit around the planet. As the first stage burnt off, the path was checked, verified, and the engines finally cut off. It was time to release the 4 external boosters and allow the middle to go. But not all went well. The boosters exploded as they decoupled from the main rocket, thankfully not damaging the main fuselage. The ship was then planned for its first attempt at part 1 of geosynchronous orbit. It was aligned. The fairings were decoupled on Geosat 2, allowing it to finally be exposed to the ever-volatile nature of space, and the rocket was aligned for its burn. With the first burn successful, this put Geosat 2 on stage 1 of its geosynchronous orbit. It was then aligned up for a second burn to get it into the final stage of geosynchronous orbit. The unfortunate part was, with the Griffin engines being used, we did not have the accurate start and stop that we hoped for. And as that final burn commenced, and the rocket took itself to a near geosynchronous orbit around Kerbal, we left our rocket. With this being the final launch of the Geosat and Orbiter program. Once Geosat 2 has been deployed and the Kerbal is safely returned back to the planet, the entire program will be scrapped. A new rocket will be designed. This rocket will be based on the Alpha program. The rocket will be built on a bigger fuselage size, and the satellite will be designed in a smaller frame, making it less top-heavy. The ultimate fail of the Geosat program and the Orbiter program was the rockets were too top-heavy. With this knowledge now acquired and learned from the original Geosat and Orbiter program, we can now progress with the Alpha program, redesign the system, and launch the next set of geosynchronous satellites. I'd like to thank you all for watching this recap and documentary of the rise and fall of the Geosat and Orbiter program. I hope you enjoyed it. This was my first attempt at massive editing of my video. If you liked, please hit that like button. If you want to see more, hit that subscribe. And we'll be back with more episodes of Kerbal, and hopefully, this time, with better design, more successful launches, and less failures. Thank you all again for watching, and we'll catch you next time on Conquering the World of Kerbal. Thank you.